People may have noticed that I've finally started making more videos on education, and my exact stances on education can be sometimes hard to fully track. The reasons for that are complicated, and I could go into them if you wanted me to. But it's because I do believe there is actual problems in education administration all the way through the system, bloat and overhead. I do not think that most of the literacy crises are directly related to instruction because they're ubiquitous in the industrialized world. I also don't think that these crises can be explained by genetics or inheritability because they happen to come on so fast. They came on within less than a decade. Um, but I have noticed an increasing anti-college narrative crop up. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I still think that there are high limitations to the narrative that we should fix everything with college, but I've also seen a lot of overcorrections in policy, particularly some recent Trump policies in the Department of Education, mirroring a policy that we have here in Utah that will have pernicious effects but are being sold to the public in a dishonest way. I mean, who knew, right? The government lying to you. It's always been a problem in our government, but it seems to have exponentially increased lately. But anyway, I'm going to respond to a video and I'm going to start by summarizing it. But here I'm going to show you the video. I don't really do clips here. That requires a production budget and specific timing and how long I'm going to share. But this video is the anti-college narrative explained by urgent firings. Now, I like urgent firings. I actually watch them a good bit because they cover issues in advising students into job and career placement, and they basically represent a kind of real research liberal opinion on that front. So if you want to go check out their channel, I would definitely suggest it. And just like with articles and books, don't trust my summary just because I give it to you. Go watch the original video. I'm just trying to give you enough that you can contextualize yourself what I'm talking about and what I'm responding to. So the speaker at Urgent Firings uses Utah as a primary case study for how successful education systems are being intentionally undermined at both the state and federal level. There's some specific details regarding Utah, and I'm going to complicate some things that this particular content maker, I hate that term, said, but I am going to mostly agree with his analysis at first, and then we're going to kind of break it apart. So what prompted that video, and it is a little while back, it's from about 4 months ago, was the Utah legislature passing a bill, House Bill 265, which was passed on March 26, 2025, where the governor claimed that this was a necessary reform to cut costs for education by removing $60 million from public universities in the state, putting certain universities into quasi-receivership, such as Utah State University, and I'll get into that example. And the governor moved this money to a strategic investment fund where supposedly universities could earn these funds back if they prove that they slashed jobs, defunded programs deemed irrelevant to the academic curriculum, particularly programs that did not lead to high-end earning immediately after completing your degree. We'll come back to that because there's some deceptive stuff in these statistics that a lot of people are ignoring because it sounds good until you find out more about the difference between immediate earnings and long-term earnings, and align the budget strictly within the state's workforce needs, although who the fuck knows what they are because AI has already changed all that twice since this bill was passed last year. The political irony in this, as the speaker in Urgent Firings video, I don't know his name, said was that Utah had the most affordable tuition in the country for public universities, which is actually true. Utah already possessed one of the strongest job markets in the nation. And as of last year, it was one of the best to be a young person in. It's reversed. Now it is, as of 2026, it's actually one of the worst markets to be a young person in. Governor Cox had previously campaigned on expanding education and increasing salaries for both secondary and higher ed employees, where he mildly delivered on the first, he actually turned against the second. Now, there was some selection bias in Urgent Firing's video, though. He talked about the situation of receivership at USU. Where there was a loss of school spirit due to the rehauling of the humanities and writing department. Now, I actually think the problem with that is that while USU did have a good school spirit, there's a lot of things missing from it. USU is a research university, but it's also an ag school. The reason why there is so much backlash is a very linguistic justice curriculum was imposed by a very small committee of professors who did so on a technical writing program, not even a composition program, to go teach these courses, and with very little training for how to integrate and deal with the pushback they would get from a majority white, majority male college population, because the undergraduate program is mostly still an agriculture school, while the graduate programs are more along the lines of normal liberal arts research institutions. This led to a lot of scandals and a lot of audits and investigations. The author points out Elizabeth Cantwell, who allegedly spent over $500,000 in office renovations and luxury items, came in for a short tenure but was removed within 1 year. I will say I agree that the spirit has been crushed, but the initial anger at the quote unquote woke curriculum in the writing department was actually very, very real. And it was partially because the people implementing it were poorly trained. USU had become a research institution very quickly, and many of their graduate programs just didn't seem to have the proper onboarding to deal with their student body's disconnection from the graduate student body. Now, there are other elements of the VidU, the student debt paradox, the entrepreneurial myth, the devaluing of American labor, online alternatives, the expansion of ed tech, which is itself a form of privatization. And we'll talk about a lot of this. But the issue with USU in particular was interesting to me because it actually is a flashpoint where the culture wars on both sides of the ledger have really alienated the student community. Now, Urgent Firings argues that Utah is a prime example of politicians defunding programs they deem unessential to the workforce, particularly in the liberal arts, to gain more control over the population and redirect funds without the political fallout of a direct tax hike. And I think that's probably true. And they do this through a variety of ways. One is ignoring the student debt paradox, which I'll go into. Two is pushing this idea of massive amounts of millionaire entrepreneurs. This is an old gambit. It's probably as old as at least the 1980s. And then pushing alternatives that are supposedly cheaper. So, official responses to Utah House Bill 2065, which passed again last year, has been a mix of strategic cooperation from the university leadership and pointed oversight, including partial receiverships of programs from state legislatures, mirroring what the Trump administration has tried to do with more elite colleges. The video portrays this as a violent attack on the university system, and in some ways I would agree with it. While the official narrative is a great reallocation. Now, Governor Spencer Cox and state leadership, particularly House Speaker Mike Schultz, famous for both supporting and pulling back on the current data center project here in Utah, recently stated that the goal was to keep tuition low by reevaluating programs that don't work and moving money into high priority areas like nursing, engineering, and critical mineral research and development. The governor signed a resolution on January 2026, emphasizing that higher education must remain outcome focused to stay worthy of the program trust, reinforcing the initial bill. Most university presidents in the state have adopted a tone of what we might call cautious partnership, which is probably done to ensure they will receive all the funds that were withheld. University of Utah's president, Taylor Randall, described the bill as an opportunity to reinvent ourselves. The U of U faced the largest cuts, nearly 20 million, has been working to realign its high-wage workforce demand to earn the money back. Weaver State University leadership acknowledged that this was a difficult decision regarding programs and positions which would be necessary. They focused their plan on reducing tuition for associate's degrees to meet the bill's efficiency requirements. Utah State University, which is where there's been the most contention, had key issues. USU's plan was initially rejected. Newly appointed President Brad Mortensen recently presented a revised plan, and the state legislature released 30% of the funds held back from USU, but is withholding the remaining 70%, roughly $8.8 million, pending a full audit of the previous administration's spending. House Speaker Mike Schultz expressed concerns that previous spending, specifically renovations mentioned in the video, make lawmakers really nervous, leading to the decision to keep the university on a yellow light status, despite the fact they have cooperated with things like changing their entire writing program to be a Western philosophy program and adding the history of Christianity to history courses required for students to take in a secular manner, of course. The Utah Board of Higher Education is the UBHE has been the primary enforcer for this, creating metrics that universities must follow. These include wage outcomes, targeting median range of graduates at both the first year and 5 years post-graduation. We'll get to that. That's tricky. Timely completion, favoring programs where students finish faster. And I will admit, particularly in graduate programs, it has been ironic to me that many of the least paying graduate programs do take the longest. So English and history and a few of the humanities can take 8 to 9 years on average to complete to get your PhD, whereas many science fields can have an average completion of about 5 years. Yeah. So I'm not saying there's nothing to this, but there is something going on. Furthermore, there is a strict 120-hour credit limit for most degrees to reduce time in studies and perhaps cost. So it's interesting to look at this. In response to UHB 265, universities submitted strategic reinvestment plans, as I mentioned. These plans detail exactly what programs are being cut and which are being prioritized for growth. The official stance from the USHE is that reallocation moves about $40 million, about 80% of total funds, directed directly into instruction and research, with a heavy emphasis on high wage, high demand outcomes. But again, hard to say. The high priority areas, as identified by the state, are healthcare, technology and AI, engineering and manufacturing, and aviation and defense. Programs slated for for divestment are liberal arts emphasis studies such as ethics, concentration in philosophy, mini literature and degrees, American studies, and international agribusiness, weirdly. French, Spanish, and German teaching degrees have been consolidated in favor of more generalized tasks, so they're not specialized anymore. Applied climatology and agricultural communication have been reduced and set for divestment. And millions are supposedly being saved by cutting men in management and administrative roles to pivot funds towards student-facing retention teams. Now, I don't know that the retention teams will work, but sometimes I do like it when we reduce administrative bloat. The performance metrics are where things get a little bit interesting. To keep programs funded, median earnings of graduates after 1 and 5 years have to be studied. Programs are redesigned for students to finish in exactly 120 or 60 credit hours, and the ratio of job earnings of job openings over a 5-year period are supposed to be realigned to match the number of graduates. And on the latter, I actually think that's not a terrible idea. For students currently in divested programs, the official response from schools like USU and Weber State is a teach-out guarantee. This means university is legally and ethically obligated to continue offering necessary classes while currently enrolled students are in school, but no new freshmen can declare those majors, and there will be a time of divestment for those departments. Now, here's an interesting thing. The claim that liberal arts graduates are permanently low earners is a common misconception. It's just not backed up by the studies. Though it's rooted in some early career truth, and it's something we have to take into mind, data from 2004 to 2006 means that there is a slow burn financial trajectory for majors that often surprises skeptics. So while they start behind in relative earnings, liberal arts graduates tend to experience rapid wage growth in their 30s and 40s about 10 years out. They often narrow the gap with their STEM counterparts who aren't in high demand fields, such as, before AI coding or biostatisticians and things like that. And they often surpass their business major counterparts significantly by mid-career. But mid-career is more than 5 years out. And that's an interesting thing to notice. Urgent firings actually says this partially have to do for the sorting in personality and drive. We can come back to that. Maybe we can talk about that later. Liberal arts majors often face an underemployment in their first few years after graduation. And I think most people know that, which often leads to low income stereotype. However, this data shows significant increases as they age. Liberal arts majors in their early career often start off around $45,000 to $50,000, while computer science, at least prior to AI, or engineering majors often start out between $75,000 to $90,000 a year. But liberal arts graduates meet the $95 range, whereas many of the other science majors actually stall out. For example, political science majors and history majors often catch up to chemistry majors by their 30s and 40s, both earning a median income of $90,000 mid-career. Now, these are early 2006 numbers, but you get what I'm talking about. So if we're going to be wonks here, we can see that part of this is deliberately limited to studies that have a very short study range. It's very hard to keep up with longitudinal studies in a very unstable economy over the course of someone's life, because trends 10 to 15 years later could be rapidly differently for a different age cohort. But it's also very misleading to base things off of initial earnings, because some fields have high earnings early on, but stall out in the middle, and some don't. The reason for this is actually quite interesting and something that Urgent Firings has talked about, although in another video. While STEM majors are often hired for specific technical tasks, liberal arts majors are frequently promoted to management, communications, and strategy roles, which value critical thinking and emotional intelligence. And AI hasn't totally stopped that, because someone's got to check the damn AI output. Nearly 40% of liberal arts degrees pursue a master's or professional degree, law, MBAs, MFAs, MAs, PhDs, etc., which provides a second salary jump that vocational degrees often lack. And many of these fields are recession resistant because they move back and forth between private and public funding. Liberal arts graduates change their careers more frequently than technical majors because they have a more flexible degree set. While this creates a messy and limited starting career, it creates the ease of pivoting into high growth industries, marketing, HR, etc., when people find their footing. Now, I don't love all this. You guys know how I feel about marketing and HR, but it's actually somewhat true that humanities majors change their careers many times. I am proof. I have worked in the following fields, most of which I was done with by the time I was 27, but still, I have been a pizza cook. I have been a pizza joint manager. I have been a loading docks worker. I have been a insurance customer service agent. I have been a build out guy at a big box hardware store. I have been a corrections officer. I have been an adjunct professor. I have been a non-tenure track university lecturer, and I have been a high school teacher. And these last three, I go back and forth between. In addition to doing editorial work as a side gig, you may have known that I used to be a reader and editor over there at Zero Books, and a podcaster. I'm doing okay. Now, I'm not saying this to promote the humanities or even saying that, namby-pamby liberal studies degrees are super great. In fact, I do think focusing on more blue-collar labor is often missed in both policy and this video. But the video I'm talking about urgent firing, but even the stats I'm talking about right now have problems. But I do think that we should be very careful about over-concluding from early career earning statistics and the difficulty of actually applying any of these in a technically sound manner throughout the entirety of someone's career. So one of the major reasons given for why liberal arts majors tend to just do better, as like I said, than you would expect, is they have a high adaptability rate. And in fact, Urgent Firings goes on to argue that they also attract certain personalities who are more given towards nonconformity. So when is the return on investment actually low? Liberal arts as a waste may be a myth, but there are specific areas where completion risks are low, are subfields where it just doesn't make sense. For example, visual arts and psychology, who do not get advanced degrees, never really make more than the 60K mark on the median income, no matter what part of their career and life they're in, at least in the current society that we live in. They tend to focus on the bottom 20% of college graduates. If students take on more than 100K in debt for degrees that pay only starts at 45K in the first decade, the interest rate alone will wipe out mid-career gains in employment. So if you go to really elite schools and pay for it yourself with a high debt load, a lot of the advantages go away. So liberal arts degrees are not low earners mid-career, with the exception of two very specific served fields if you don't get higher education in them. But they are much riskier careers, and they have a slow burn, and it's a lot more on the individual to be creative with what they learn. In 2026, the return on investment debate moved past simple salary numbers to focus on time to payoff and lifetime wealth. But this is not what's been put in legislation either in Utah or by the Department of Education under Trump. The comparison between elite liberal arts colleges and large public universities reveal a trade-off between quick wins and long-term wins, and I'm going to talk about that. So if we look how things stack up from rankings like the Wall Street Journal, CEW Georgetown, and FastWeb, you see some interesting things. Public universities dominate the rankings for short-term return on investment. Because their tuition is subsidized by the state, particularly for in-state tuition, the time to pay off the degree is actually pretty fast. The leaders are Baruch College and CUNY, Georgia Tech, and UCA Berkeley, which is what you'd expect. These are public universities, but they're fairly elite and also fairly technical. So at Baruch College, for example, the tuition is low enough and the value added is high enough that graduates usually pay off their degrees pretty quickly. In fact, the earnings to net cost of education is about 2 months. It doesn't mean people actually pay off their loans in 2 months, but it means that then the entire cost of education is usually recouped in 2 months of work. Now, these schools are vocational engines. They align perfectly with the Utah model, getting students high-paying jobs in tech and business roles immediately. But if you look at 5 and 10 years, things change dramatically. Elite liberal arts schools actually do the best for long-term earnings over 5 years. And the leaders in this are Harvey Mudd, Column, Williams, and Swarthmore, colleges you probably haven't heard of. Harvey Mudd College currently holds the top spot for long-term return on investment with projected lifetime gains of $4.5 million per student. These schools produce managers. Georgia Tech grad might start salary as an engineer, but a Williams or Swarthmore grad earns statistically more as they are likely to move into executive leadership law specialized careers over the term of their life. Their salary ceilings are much higher, and they also tend to come from elite backgrounds anyway, which is not factored in either of these comparisons, but is something to note as something you should factor in. Where this gets most hard to parse is mid-tier schools. So the most significant finding in 2026 is that the crisis isn't liberal arts elite schools versus large public universities. It's about prestige versus price. High return on investment schools, elite private liberal arts colleges in particular, and flagship public research universities do tend to help, and those elite private liberal arts schools have large endowments which do usually help them cover tuition for the poor. The people who get left along in that are actually mid-income earners. But mid-tier expensive private schools that lack a proper brand name or elite status don't allow for high levels of networking. These schools often have the same sticker price as Harvard, but without the networking for social capital, those careers don't tend to go super high, and mid-career caps tend to be between 100 and 150K, which is still way above the average median income, even for a family, but not when you factor in the cost of the degree, which often isn't factored in reporting on income. So, urgent firings talks about all this, though, as playing into a long-term playbook to devalue higher education. And I've mentioned before that the same arguments have been made about higher education going all the way back to William Buckley's God and Man at Yale, back when there was no evidence of a high liberal bias in the high-level institutions, and that the federal government's ties to those institutions, particularly in the intelligence agencies and the FBI, were somewhat epic. if we use Utah as a starting point, Urgent Firings argues that the political and corporate interests are intentionally sabotaging using universities to create a more controllable and cheaper workforce. Now, this is somewhat impossible to prove without clear statements, but there is enough evidence from conservative strategy to see this as a real power move, particularly with selling things about reindustrialization while not doing any policy that would encourage it. So one is you get stuck in a vicious cycle of funding in education. The Urgent Firing speaker outlines pretty precisely the political strategy that has been used to shift public anger from politicians to university figureheads and from capitalists to managers. Now, I don't love managers, and I think, and I've argued that there is a real problem with the petite bourgeois cultural norms in a lot of managers who are technically part of the working class by their dependence on the wage fund. But, and this is a big but, this is maybe a thick old but, there's a lot of tricks here. Politicians have often cut university funding to avoid it raising taxes, which can appear very virtuous to voters. Schools are forced to raise tuition or fees to cover the gap. In Georgia, where I'm from, tuition was somewhat capped because of the state's promise to cover the tuition for B students, but fees could go up astronomically, leading to a situation where sometimes the fees were even more than the tuition. I don't know if that's still true. This was in the 2000s. This gets a public backlash. I mean, it causes anger at schools for raising tuitions, which gives politicians more ammunition to justify defunding. And when they defund more, tuition continues to go up. Furthermore, elite schools don't care about this anyway. They make most of their money from endowments and from land holdings. They're, Columbia and NYU are the largest landlords in New York City. But these big and mid-tier public schools where the majority of students go, not the elite ones where people focus on because that's where most journalists go to, actually are more affected because they're less dependent on endowments and hospitals and being landlords. The goal that the legislators want, and I think this is actually astute, is control. By defunding programs like liberal arts, Urgent Firings speaker argues that politicians aim to reduce critical thinking and literacy, making the politicians more susceptible to propaganda. And there's some truth probably to that. I don't know that it's actually that conscious, though, but it definitely seems to be a knock-on effect. Now, one of the most contentious parts of Public Firing's video is when he argues that there is no student debt crisis, which I actually profoundly disagree with him on. But he does have a couple of truths here that I don't want people to look at. And this has to do with the paradox at hand. So the speaker tries to differentiate a high debt situation from a crisis, arguing that the narrative is often exaggerated by those who want to skip college. Data suggests that those with the most debt have the highest lifetime earnings and thus better outcomes in home ownership and health. This includes people who go to Ivy League schools in areas that traditionally have high earning potential. He also points out that the median student debt is actually relatively low. It's between $20,000 and $25,000, which is actually about the same as an auto loan now. And now, if you go to graduate school, this goes up to about $50,000 or $60,000. And unfortunately, a lot of ways people can deal with the low earnings early on in their career cause them to get into a debt cycle. Ask me how I know. But nonetheless, it is actually true that unless you're paying $200,000 out of your pocket to go be an elementary school teacher going to Harvard, and why the hell would you do that? You don't need that. That is an irrational decision. You're probably not actually going to get stuck in debt peonage forever. But there's enough people who do, even who finish a degree, that it's a significant thing to think about. Furthermore, federal loans are managed like taxes with income-driven repayments, although Trump has complicated this greatly since the speaker spoke in this video, making this less risky than often portrayed. Not entirely sure that's true, though, and we can come back to that. But because I personally have been in income-driven repayments that mean that I have paid the cost of my loan already, and yet also still have the cost of my loan left. And also because the rules have changed 3 times since I was issued my student loan. And if things continue, I'll probably pay it off in 10 more years. Yeah. Don't pity me. I'm doing okay. I point this out because I'm not that big of an outlier. I didn't have a ton of debt. I didn't have the median average. I had more than that, but I did not have a ton for someone with a graduate degree. But I do think the risk mitigation factors of it are often not spoken about. There are, however, other things to consider because, unfortunately, urgent firing speaker is only really thinking about this from the standpoint of individuals. And we'll get back to why that's a problem. A major theme in all this is a corporate desire to lower labor cost. Micro credentialing and alternative education allows employers to pay workers less, or even when they don't, it gives them less flexibility to move in a highly specialized workforce. The more specialized you are, the more subject you are to monopsony control over a field. Just like in prices, it also affects labor prices. And this makes things difficult. The other thing is there's all kinds of backdoor subsidies for companies, in addition to things like tax rebates, which just is a straight up subsidy. See all these data centers that aren't paying any damn taxes on the power that they use. The urgent firings argues that low wages are actually subsidized by taxpayer programs such as SNAP and Medicaid, although again, they're trying to cut that too, effectively allowing corporations to avoid paying a livable wage while using public funds. And I think that's absolutely true. But again, you're going to see the attempts to claw that back, which means I don't know what it means. It means a social reproduction crisis is what it means. It looks like an active war in the population in some ways. High profile tech figures are often accused of funding Common Core or online only systems to make teachers in traditional degrees obsolete, pushing things like learn to code. But then we saw what happened that with AI, and then we saw what the AI bubble actually didn't do completely to kill the coding. Urgent Firings also says the real value of universities extracurricular and social forms of social and cultural capital that online alternatives cannot replace and should not replace. Colleges are some of the last remaining places for young people to build social networks, find partners, and gain upward mobility through meeting people. By moving that online, you remove the ability of networking to happen to people who are not from elite backgrounds. So this is another fucking glass ceiling and glass floor. Now, again, I am skeptical of everyone going to college narratives, but I do think we have to deal with the fact that this is one of the last commodified, but last broad institutions that had a broad class base where people could actually intermingle with people from other classes easily and get access through connections that they would not be easily make in their own neighborhoods, etc. That's ending. Urgent Firing says the actual value lies in access to internships, although, again, poor kids can't often do long-term internships because they're unpaid, alumni networks, and research laboratories, not just the actual content, which may be able to be delivered online, although so far the evidence is that for a median student at less efficacy. Now, is the student debt crisis as not real as the author says? I mean, it's hard for leftists to accept that because we've spent so many years talking about student loan forgiveness and universal college education. I am sympathetic to student loan forgiveness, although I don't think it's as progressive as a lot of people say it is, if progressive means benefiting the vast majority of society. However, I also don't think it's a major tax on the working class. That's kind of a bullshit way to view things. So I would say that the urgent firing speaker, like I said, I'm going to keep referring to that because I don't really know his name, is accurate that on the individual level, there's a paradox in student debt. But what he glosses over is some of the sharper edges of the debt narrative that really can cut people and society. The video correctly points out a major irony that people most crushed by debt are those who often take the least of it in the $5,000 to $15,000 range. These students are typically students who started a degree but did not finish. They often go to private, for-profit colleges, but even if they don't, maybe they're getting an associate degree at a local community college. They have all the debt, but no income bump from the degree to pay it off. And this can lead to major problems for them. And this is a huge category of people. While the median is around 25,000, there's roughly 7% of borrowers who owe more than 100K. These are often graduate students, doctors, and lawyers who do have high incomes, but the interest rates on those balances can make the debt feel like a forever tax and more importantly, discourage people from going into those fields. While we do have an overabundance of lawyers, we actually have a direct shortage of doctors, although some of that's not just from the cost of education and the years involved, which are frankly too many, but also from the fact that the medical schools have basically not adjusted their enrollment goals at the behest of the ADA, the American Doctor Association, keeping the number of doctors graduating low and subsidizing the lack of American graduates by taking doctors from other countries who are paid for often in more socialized systems. Sure, fucking way to make us popular, right? Have you ever wondered why most of your primary care doctors are like from Iran? Well, there you go. Furthermore, there is a crisis of high balances, and these all add up. Even if indebted balances are manageable for the individual, the total amount of debt, 1.7 trillion, I believe, delays major lifestones for millions, such as buying homes or starting families, which has a considerable cooling effect on the broader economy. So the concern about student loans actually should really be real, even if on an individual basis it is paradoxical. So, does this urgent firing video strike you as fair? I think as a persuasive essay, it's fair enough, but let's talk about the biases in its interpretation. Where I think the video is most correct is return on investment of college. It is still true, even now, even after AI, that over the course of a lifetime, college graduates earn significantly more. However, right now, there's been less hiring of college graduates, and college graduates have been going into more low-skilled jobs. Here's the job numbers of the last job report this quarter of 2026. This is the second quarter, which saw better job numbers at lower wage jobs, and it also showed that between retirements, men opting out to be stay-at-home partners, disability, etc., and men delaying entering the workforce later and later. That 1 in 3 men are who could work are currently not doing so. I also think there's a lot of evidence that urgent firing is right, that there is a vicious cycle of defunding, and this is known as the starving the beast phenomenon, where you defund a service until it starts to fail, use the failure to justify more defunding, and ever the vicious cycle continues. And this has not just been used in education, but on every major social service in the United States. And it's not just unique to the United States. Look at the way the UK does the NHS, or Canada does the provincial healthcare service, and you'll see similar problems. Where the video, I think, falls apart or oversimplifies things, urgent firings does not really deal with administrative bloat. Politicians are responsible for tuition hikes, and while the speaker of the urgent firings video mentions bureaucrats, many critics, including myself, argue that administrative overhead is actually a huge cost of the tuition, and why the hikes have continued, not just because of state cuts, because the biggest period of state cuts was in the 80s and 90s, and the hikes have outpaced that. Whereas the massive amounts of non-teaching staff have actually expanded, partly due to legal compliance and partly due to it being a way to be another earning path in universities. The idea that politicians want uneducated population to control is an impossible to prove and thus ideological claim. While cuts to liberal arts do impact critical thinking, the proponents of those cuts argue they're simply trying to help students get jobs in a competitive economy. And while there has been a 50-year trend of starving the beast, there's no real clear proof that it's because you want a population that can't critically think. Honestly, and I'm being very sincere about this, critical thinking has not declined or expanded very much in the 20th century, except by declines and expansions of literacy. So when literacy was going up, critical thinking was going up. Now that literacy is going down, and I mean this traditional reading-based literacy, all other forms of literacy goes down, including video literacy, reading literacy, emotional intelligence, etc. Another thing that I would say is that urgent firings comparing of a student loan to an auto loan is a little bit misleading, because you can discharge an auto loan in bankruptcy, or you can sell the car. You can do neither of those two things with student debt. Student debt is nearly impossible to discharge in bankruptcy. One of the reforms I've actually asked for is to allow it to be discharged in bankruptcy, making it a more permanent financial burden, hence why there are tax-like elements to its functioning, because otherwise it would be crushing to the entire economy. So the video is accurate in its defense of the investment and economic value of an education in most cases, but its explanations are a little bit over ideological. That said, I suspect that the author's right. I just don't think we can prove it. And I also think sometimes it doesn't matter whether people mean to be doing something or just that it's an effect. The video continues at the end to argue that the anti-college narrative is essentially a class war designed to pull the ladder up from the working and middle classes being able to compete with the children of the elite. It suggests by devaluing degrees, ending the third space narrative of education, elites are ensuring that high-level wealth and influence remain exclusive to those already at the top. I kind of see this in the middle class too. I will say this is one of the things that I talk about with opportunity hoarding, masking as virtue hoarding, and representation masking as systemic justice is an actual issue. And people have accused me of sounding conservative on this, but I think it's just true. So it is true that education is the last easy path for social mobility, and it's not that easy and not that effective. The speaker argues that for middle Americans, whoever that is, or for even impoverished people, college is the only way of retaining ways to move into higher social classes. For me, it was a way to move into higher social classes while actually still not being able to replicate the home ownership of my parents easily. This video argues that by skipping college education, the elite prevent people from getting credentials needed to enter higher pay in professional circles, thus leaving the competition to their own children. Many of the people who tell you that not to send your kids to college send their own kids to college. He also notes that despite the millionaire entrepreneur myth, over half of America's millionaires have a master's degree or higher. In fact, 70% of millionaires are employees who have significant investments, not entrepreneurs or business owners. This includes doctors, engineers, and senior management. The weird stratification of the working class is something that even Marxists have not properly dealt with, and it shows. The entrepreneurship trap is a particularly vicious trap for the poor. This people claims that rich people put the idea of skipping college and becoming an entrepreneur specifically to the poor, and I've seen this also with minority communities. It shifts the blame for poverty onto the individual. If you are poor, it's because you weren't good enough at being an entrepreneur, even though most entrepreneurs historically fail, even rich ones. Rather than systemic wage stagnation, lack of access to high-paying jobs, or even a lack of access to significant capital to be an entrepreneur. Most entrepreneur success requires a safety net or high capital overhead that the working class and even large swaths of the white-collar working class, aka the middle class, don't have. Furthermore, corporations receive billions in subsidies and use taxpayer-funded research from universities to fund private profits. And in fact, most of the major technology shifts, except for AI, weirdly, have come out of either universities or more likely the Department of Defense, and they are just simply given to private corporations to then patent. They pay workers below a livable wage, forcing the state to supplement those workers with all kinds of programs. And as those programs get steadily cut by the government to save money and finance its debt, it's likely to start leading to major social unrest, since we've been able to support the economy by subsidizing low-income work and directly through welfare programs. Yes, Virginia, welfare programs are actually a corporate subsidy. That's why I'm a Marxist, not a progressive. All right. So a lot of cultural scapegoating goes on and a focus on rural white men. Rural white men are a very small part of the population because rural people are a very small part of the population. You have to run them over, and I do think it's something we actually have to start dealing with, and I'm going to start thinking about that more. I come from a semi-rural area, so even though I grew up on the outskirts of a city, the other outskirts were farmland and forestry. So yeah. The speaker talks about a thing that we've all kind of forgotten about, which is diversity, equity, inclusion phenomenon, or the liberal arts, which tells working class white men or other poor people that might not that other kinds of poor people are their enemies, increasing a form of alienation from the worker, making solidarity harder to do. And I'm actually sympathetic to this argument. The speaker also argues that a magic trick to keep the working class from noticing the real economic power is being stripped away by billionaires and tech CEOs, and any pretense to meritocracy is being removed. And while the old pretenses to the meritocracy were largely faced, they're being replaced with stuff that's worse, which is how it normally goes. The destruction of the third place also means that there's less and less opportunity for people not in elite circles to be able to push and develop large scale social capital to move up the economic ladder. I only got good jobs because I met people, guys. I come from a blue collar background. It was merit, but it still took a lot of fucking luck. I've said this before, but if a professor hadn't offered me a job in South Korea, I probably would have been in a much worse situation during the Great Recession and never had the chance to travel the country and educate myself and participate in global label struggles and meet people from all over the world and have the time to read and do and think and be able to do what I do for you now. It really is a privilege, and it really was one that knowing someone helped me do, even though I had to work my ass off to get it. It is not the case that this did not involve work. It's the case that the work by itself would not have been enough. So, as of current the college wage premium rates remains high for those already in the workforce, although AI has disrupted the hiring of new college grads and younger college grads who have a higher than average unemployment right now. That seems to have been slightly corrected for in the last round of earnings, but it's part of the many things that have tripped off devaluations of the stock market right now, particularly in tech. So the cost of college is a significant barrier. The Bureau of Labor Statistics continues to show that the employment rate for a bachelor's degree is stagnant right now. But if you look at all levels of employment, it still is better than those with just a high school diploma. But if you're just entering the workforce as of the middle of 2026, that's a little different. The wealth gap between those with a degree and those without it is actually accelerating now. Although, again, that is complicated by recent graduates not finding work. So the anti-college narrative is loud. Its economic reality seems contestable. Now, I'm not here to celebrate the need for college. In fact, I think it is a tragedy. I would love college to be available for those who want it and have the capacity to do that kind of abstract labor. I really would, and I want it to be cheap. But it like all education, will not be a fix to all of our problems. However, we should also stop lying to people that it doesn't do anything, because that's false. The data shows that we have a hollowed out middle strata. Those without degrees have seen their real dollar wealth stagnate or fall, even if their incomes have been a little better lately. Degree holders are capturing the vast majority of new wealth generated in the post-2020 economy, even if they've hit a wall with AI in the last year. Utah has a fascinating paradox. It is still, weirdly, the number one in the nation for social mobility, the ability to out on one's parents, but that has dried up relatively quickly in this state. Its universities are undergoing a radical shift towards vocationalism and certain kinds of corrections that are sold to the public as going to save them money on tuition, while it's likely to do the opposite. Tuition will continue to increase. And this is already changing with paired with AI, the way social mobility works, aka it doesn't. There's very few ladders of social mobility in the United States, and this one does seem to be going away. I will put a relatively extensive works cited in the show notes so you guys to check me out, as well as the original video that I was responding to. I'd like to thank all my supporters. You can get access behind the paywall by going and finding my Patreon at Varn Vlog with V on Patreon. And if you don't want to do that, and I completely understand, economic times can be hard. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment, or go review my podcast, which is available also for free. Although this episode won't be on the free feed because those are just interview episodes. And get the name out. Also share this. I really could use some shares, peeps. I am not a monetized channel, and while YouTube swears it doesn't factor that into the algorithm, I don't totally believe them. There seems to be a feedback loop there. All right. But in all else, if you do none of those things, protect your peace. Don't give up on a better for tomorrow, and don't let people convince you of bullshit. Take care.